The title is not a lie. In this video, I will be arguing that a remake of Fire Emblem Genealogy of the Holy War could be improved by adding an avatar. Not just any avatar, a specific one. But before I do that, I first have to talk about avatars as a concept. My definition of an avatar in Fire Emblem is a character which is referenced by the game to be the player's representative in the world. The main way this is done is through character creation, which, even if it's just a name, explicitly tells you that this character is influenced by your decisions. My list of avatars does not differ from the norm, but I think it is useful to define this function of avatars since it tells us their purpose. Avatars connect the player with the world, explicitly giving them a vehicle in it. Rather than going on a journey with a character, you're going on one through them. I'd like to start this off by going through most of the previous avatars and discussing how they've been used. Mark is the first character you get to name. You also get to give them an affinity, or rather a birthday, which gives them an affinity based on the month. Importantly, Mark never speaks, and outside of a few brief story moments, is rarely even seen or addressed. They're not the protagonist, they don't drive the story. They have very little impact on much of anything, with one main exception. They're the tactician, who's explicitly stated to be directing the characters in battle. This is exactly what you do when you play the game, which means that even though they're rarely seen, you're always connected with their role. In that way, Mark is a true neutral avatar, with their role in the game straying very little from the control you have over it. The rest of the avatars are more expansive in their application, and there's a few important effects they have on their games. The big shift after Mark is that all the other avatars are actual units, and they range in quality from pretty good to the best characters in their games. The next two, Kris and Robin, are on the extreme end of this. Considering that Fire Emblem has had no trouble having protagonists who were bad units before, the only real explanation for this is to act as a power fantasy for the player. Aside from that feeling slightly like pandering, the way avatars are described and used narratively doesn't really fit this. They can be capable combatants, sure, but their greatest strengths, which are often praised by other characters, are mental ones. Whether that be the strategic mind of Kris and Robin, the compassion of Corrin, or the leadership of Byleth. With the advent of the modern support, the avatars took on the function of the blank canvas for allowing other characters to portray themselves. With little personality of their own, most conversations are led by the other character, leading to easier writing opportunities. However, I don't think that's a great reason to include an avatar. Supports in Path of Radiance, for example, work just as well without one. In addition, having fewer supports, from removing a character that needs to have a support with every other character, gives the writers more time to improve the ones that are there. That's on top of any innate issues with supports. Those are the general use cases for avatars, but there's more specific ones unique to each individual. Kris is uniquely similar to what I'll be talking about later in the video, since after all, just like what I'm going to be suggesting, they're an avatar that's being added to a remake. In that regard, Kris presents an interesting question with their existence, which is summed up nicely in the intro cutscene. Rather than just accepting that they were changing the story of Fe4 Book 2 by adding Kris, it suggested that the reason Kris wasn't there was because the story told in the original game was inaccurate, a simplified version that excluded Kris for some reason, and now this game is going to tell you the truth. This is a really cool concept that opens up a number of questions about the story. If the first game was a lie, who was telling it? History is written by the victors, so I'd guess Marth or his descendants, and so does that mean the story is less black and white than it might originally seem? Do the villains actually have good reasons to do what they do? Is Marth not as virtuous as is shown in the original? But no, the reason Kris is excluded from the story is because Kris just didn't want the credit. They justify it by explaining that they want Marth to seem like a greater hero, which kind of fits into some of those previous ideas, but it's portrayed as a selfless act from Kris, not a selfish one from Marth. It ends up feeling rather contrived, and throws away those interesting ideas that the story seemed to have, since the only major thing that was left out of the original was Kris. Now, another common critique that I don't have a strong opinion on personally is that Kris steals the spotlight away from other characters, particularly Jagan. If Kris had an interesting narrative implementation, I would be defending such decisions, but because they don't, I do think this is a perception that is to be avoided. In fact, the biggest lesson to take away from Kris is that if you're adding such an important character to a remake, have a good reason for adding them. Not in the sense of explaining why they weren't in the previous game, but in terms of thematic narrative reasons. Because if you don't, you're likely changing the source material for the worse. And to some extent, I believe that statement, if you're adding a character, have a good thematic reason for them to exist, applies to all avatars, not just ones in remakes. A thematic question in Fire Emblem Awakening is whether one should sacrifice themselves for the greater good. At 3 points in the game, you're asked to make a decision with such consequences, weighing whether a character's life is worth the chance that things might turn out better. Even with little other narrative choices, having a few really important decisions gives a decent amount of reason for the avatar, as it not only rationalizes why the player gets to make that decision, but also grounds them in it, especially when the character whose life is being questioned is that of the avatar, which is the case for the second two. However, as cool as that could potentially be, it's kinda hampered by the first two choices being meaningless. Whatever you choose, the same thing happens, outside of some dialogue from the character that makes the decision. And yes, I had to say, the character that makes the decision, not the avatar. For some reason, it's Chrom that you're deciding for in the first decision, which really takes away a lot of the point of making Robin the avatar. It's a bit of a mess, but there's some potential in there, much like a lot of Awakening. Fates is more explicitly all about a decision, one big one, which really does impact the game. Do you side with Hoshido or Nor? An avatar character allows for each side of the story to be seen through the same character. With you getting to basically decide the most important decision in their entire life, there's a valid case for them being an avatar. It means that any consequences of that decision are on you, and you can be led to question why you made your choice. However, that all depends on the choice actually being interesting. Nor and Hoshido, the two royal houses that rule major territories in the land of... well, the name doesn't matter. They're at war. You're a prince of Nor, and are just starting to help out your family in the war effort, but are captured by your enemies. Surprisingly though, they explain that you're not from Nor. You were kidnapped as a child and raised by Nor, but you're actually part of the Hoshidan royal family. Now you have to decide between Hoshido, the family you were taken from, your birthright, or Nor, the family you grew up with, your conquest. On top of that, as you've gone along, you've seen that under the leadership of Garen, Nor is committing heinous acts in the war, executing prisoners, creating soulless monsters with no inhibitions, and using you to smuggle a weapon of mass destruction into Hoshido. This all turns it into a messy decision. To side with Nor in particular, the player could have a number of different reasons, including ones in which they decide against being moral, in fact primarily ones. However, any nuance is crushed as soon as Corrin opens their mouth after the decision. Since they're so characterized, they have very specific thoughts and opinions on the matter. And on top of that, it also really doesn't seem to be much of a decision for them. No matter which side you choose, Corrin believes everything Hoshido tells them about their past in the war, cares about both families, and believes that Nor is the side in the wrong. As a result, Corrin siding with Nor doesn't really make sense. So much so that if you're at all invested in the story, and Corrin in particular as an avatar, you'll likely be drawn out of it by this. As an avatar, they should represent you in the world, but if their motivations are so clearly contradictive of yours, then you stop thinking of them as you, and instead as just any other protagonist, and likely with some resent for the fact that the game tried to convince you that they were ever your avatar. With the decision in Fates, the one thing that justifies them being an avatar, Corrin fails at the main goal an avatar should have, to make you feel like you're playing them. And while this can be a problem for other avatars on a smaller scale, it's a major one for Corrin because that decision is oh so important. Well, at least the decision matters, unlike in Awakening. Except, I've been lying. As you know, because you know Fire Emblem, there is not a choice in Fire Emblem Fates. The choice is outside of Fates, when you pick which box art you liked better. Because unless you buy digital copies of both versions, the decision is made for you. You get the first 6 chapters to mull over the decision you already made based on superficial reasons. Byleth is far and away the best avatar they've made, which is a refreshing surprise. The main things that make Byleth work is that they connect you with the unique mechanics of 3 houses. Byleth takes on the role of a teacher for the characters, and you take on the role of training and shaping them, exactly as a teacher would. The mechanics and narrative mesh very well, and by having Byleth have very little character of their own, it lets you rationalize decisions however you want. For example, a common decision is who you get to join your class, but Byleth never states any specific reasons for bringing in new students, leaving that up to you. A blank slate allows for role-playing, but also prevents the Corrin situation where you make a decision for one reason, and the character goes on to rationalize it in a completely different way. As the game progresses, some of the choices you have end up being very meaningful, particularly who gets to join your class. In the second half of the game, most of the characters who you don't recruit are killed, usually by you. It can make you regret not trying harder to be an ideal teacher for some students and being unable to persuade them to join your side. That's really cool and works better because Byleth is your avatar and not some other character that you can push the blame on. Three Houses also has a major choice though, which house you pick. Each side mostly has a goal which isn't so black and white. Edelgard thinks the world is corrupt and wants to change that, but has worked with bad people and is willing to go to extreme ends to make that possible. The Church wants things to remain exactly as they are, which, while not terrible, is clearly not great with the amount of rebellions and all the shit going on. Claude wants to make everyone friends and end xenophobia. Can't really think of a downside to that one, other than he's willing to side with the Church. And Dimitri is a very mad and depressed boy. I mean, it's not a perfect mix of options, but when combined with the fact that you've likely grown attached to the students, some of which may be from different houses and thus on different sides of the war, it's pretty good. And because Byleth is a blank slate avatar, there's no potential contradiction between your reasoning and their reasoning. It all leads to what could have been an amazing branching point. If you didn't choose what side you were on at the very beginning of the game, at least Fates had the fake choice 6 chapters in, so if you did have both versions, you got some time to learn about each side. But no, you literally just choose whichever lord you think is the coolest and go from there after the prologue. I get that the structure that they wanted probably worked better if you led a specific house for the first half of the game, and thus you have to make a choice. But I think the story could have done a lot more if, rather than a teacher for a specific house, you were the general combat teacher for all houses, and perhaps swapped houses each month. That way, you could give yourself a chance to meet and play with all the characters. You could then create the chapters more specifically for each house. So when it comes to the halfway point and everything goes to shit, then you make your choice of who you side with, once you actually have an investment in the characters and story and understand what they stand for. The best evidence for this is the one story where it actually happens, Black Eagles. Choosing between Edelgard and the Church is pretty compelling. I wish the other runs had this. The other stories are still engaging, but they don't use the Avatar as a concept to its full potential. For Dimitri and Claude, you might as well be choosing them in the same way you choose Ephraim or Erica, or Elowood or Hector. It can only be a meta decision based on what you feel like playing. Whereas the decision between Edelgard and the Church is one you make with your character, one you make as part of the world. Alear also exists. It's about time I talked about Fe4 anyways. Who is the protagonist of Fe4? I mean, the clear answer is both Sigurd and Seliph, right? Having multiple protagonists is not unusual for a Fire Emblem game, but it's slightly atypical here. Sigurd and Seliph are effectively protagonists of two separate games, with no overlapping points that they share this role. There's a number of Fire Emblem games with multiple protagonists where you take on an omnipresent view and jump between perspectives that are impossible in universe. There's also games where you choose between protagonists and follow them exclusively for a portion of the game. There's no problem with these directions, they have their advantages. However, Mark in FE7 seems to show a desire to change that to some degree. They act as a bridge between Lyn and Elowood mode, turning a player's first experience with the game into the overarching story of Mark. Fe4 is even more extreme, with the two generations being almost decades apart. No character really shares your experience, you're the only one that's around for every chapter. But unlike in situations like Gaiden or Valencia, where the perspective jumps between characters that are far apart doing things at the same time, it's plausible that an in-universe character could be around for all of Gen 1 and 2, something like an avatar. Now, it's all well and good that Fe4 has that space for an avatar, but what it would actually add to the game is focusing and grounding the overall story, and allowing it to better impact the player. The story of Gen 2, if extended, could have been its own game, with the events of Gen 1 only being summarized at the beginning. In fact, that's kind of the story of the first Fire Emblem game, and the 3rd and 11th by extension. Evil arises, Marth's dad goes off to defeat it, fails, Marth is forced off into exile. Many years later, Marth has to fight the evil in his stead after it has now conquered most of the world, with only pockets of resistance that Marth has to meet up with. Replace the Marths with Seliph, and it fits. But the thing is, we don't care about the dad. Marth obviously does, but we never see him. You could argue that Fe4's premise is, let's make them care about the dad. The first half of the game is just a prelude to set up the actual story and make you really invested in it. In that way, you feel more like what Marth must have felt. What was lost actually matters to you. Of the two scenes I'm showing on screen right now, one is exposition, and the other makes you feel something. There's other games that do similar things, but what makes Fe4 stand out as more than just a gimmick is how much it dedicates to it. It doesn't happen at the end of the tutorial. You spend half the game with Gen 1, so much time that you could be mistaken into thinking the game is actually wrapping up by Chapter 5. It also isn't just one character dying, it's effectively all your playable characters. Even if they don't die, they can no longer be used and only 2 are seen. Finn is made special and is loved in large part due to him being the only exception. What this does is make you really invested in Seliph's journey to take down the evil empire. Because you're not just told it's bad, you're given a reason to hate it. It's fully structured around what will make the biggest impact, not on the characters, but the player. Because whether Sigurd died at the end of Chapter 1 or Chapter 5 wouldn't really change how Seliph feels about it, only how you do. Well, I guess if he died after Chapter 1, Seliph wouldn't feel anything because he wouldn't exist, but you get what I mean. Throughout Gen 1, you grow attached to the characters, both mechanically and narratively. As they grow, help you face obstacles, you build their inventories, they fall in love with each other. It all serves to get you invested. Then when Chapter 5 comes, the game kills them all, gives you their kids, and tells you to keep fighting. Because although it isn't explicitly stated, I believe Fe4 is a revenge story. And the one getting revenge, thus the true implied protagonist, is the player. All that being said though, that's a conclusion drawn from analysis of the ludonarrative, and while that will likely affect the player's perception to some degree, it's not immediately obvious. You likely don't come away from the game thinking that the game has implied you to be the protagonist. It's something you get from analyzing the structure and content of the game as I have here. With that, an avatar seems the exact solution to this problem. Directly put the player's experience into the world. So, how would that avatar be shaped to fit that mold? Well, based on what I discussed about other avatars, they should fit the role the player takes, and so should be the tactician of the armies. They shouldn't be the spotlight, but be supportive of it, which is easy enough with Sigurd and Seliph being the focus. They need to be around for all the game, and ideally they don't take space away from already existing characters, as some people feel about Kris. We already have a character that fits most of those, and it can just be modified to fit further. Oifi. With the exception of the last 2 castles of Gen 1 and the first 3 turns of Gen 2, Oifi is around for almost the whole game. He's the closest character to being around for the whole game. He's brought along in the first place because he's said to be a smart tactician, acting as advisor to Sigurd. He's also already a character, and one which kinda gets the short end of the stick in Gen 2. Him getting promoted to Avatar, and thus getting more screen time, could be seen as a positive by Oifi fans. In my head, the first generation plays out mostly the same. Rather than a menu, the starting castles could be turned into a hub area akin to the monastery or Somniel, giving you a chance to talk to your allies before the battles, learn about them, and see how your character interacts with them. Then, in Chapter 5, when Sigurd sends the kids away, Oifi insists on staying, and does, with Shannon and the rest leaving for Tirnanog. And so we get to the big moment of Fe4. The Battle of Belhalla is not perfect. It's rather abrupt and impersonal. Sigurd's argument with Arvis is good, but once the meteors start falling, it kind of fades out and rolls the fake credits. The credits are good in the sense that they give you time to absorb what just happened, but they're very gamey, and I don't think they sell the tragedy of the moment. Going into my first playthrough of Fe4, I knew there was a second generation. I didn't know exactly what would happen, but as it was going on, I suspected that Sigurd and friends would lose. Then we got to Belhalla, and the moment wasn't quite working. It was compelling, sure, but I wasn't feeling it. That was until a thought completely shifted my perspective. That thought was not thinking about Sigurd or any of the characters I'd grown to care about that may have just died. It was thinking about a survivor who witnessed all that, all their friends die in the flames. Coming back years later, staring at this spot where all their friends died. That image of them on a hill above the castle, feeling the guilt of being the only survivor. It was only by grounding myself, my perspective, in the game through the eyes of a character that the moment really worked. And that's why I think an avatar could improve the story of Fe4, by being that grounding that gives the moment more impact. Oyfi shouldn't just hear about, but watch Sigurd and all his friends burn. Because that's what you do. And then the camera pans up from the map of Jugdral to a meeting chamber in which Oyfi is talking to Seliph. Seliph sits in contemplation for a moment, finally hearing the full story of his father for the first time. Their kids are grown up. It's time to get revenge. So, the character on the hill that first time I played the game was not Oyfi, it was Finn. But that really isn't Finn. A, Finn wasn't there, and B, well, Finn probably feels bad about what happened. It really isn't his focus is fully Leaf. That person standing on that hill with that guilt was me, as I've gone over extensively. I was placing how I wanted to feel onto Finn. But as I've described, Oyfi would have been a much closer fit. But to me at that point, Oyfi was not a unit. Finn and I had both lived with and lost all these characters. Oyfi in theory also has that connection, but the difference is in mechanics versus narrative. Units just mean more to the player than advisor characters, like Oyfi in Gen 1. I have no control over Oyfi until Gen 2, and thus less of a reason to care about him. Finn, I did have that connection to. On top of that, I saw and directed Finn to fight alongside those units that were lost, while Oyfi has a few brief conversations with some of them. Mechanics are what make games games, and as such, they have a lot of power. So as a result, I think an Avatar Oyfi should have some presence as a unit in Gen 1. There's a few logistical issues that would come up if you tried to make these changes of adding an Avatar Oyfi, and I'll go over a few solutions to those just to show that they aren't deal breakers. Fe4 has a unique issue with characters that are simultaneously units and plot relevant. How do you involve them in conversations when they might be a long distance away from them, since they can be anywhere on the map when the Lord seizes the next castle? I have a very specific but clean solution to that issue. Firstly, Oyfi isn't a unit until Chapter 3. In Chapter 3, when Sigurd takes the first castle, we have a brief scene of him walking through the market of it. A number of merchants yelling to try to sell goods to him and the knights around him. He seems to be ignoring them until one catches his attention, a merchant selling magic rings. He asks and the merchant explains that he has a warp ring, allowing the user to warp to safe places, similar to the return ring, but equivalent to the warp staff. He buys the ring, explicitly mentioning his intentions on giving it to his wife, Deirdre. We could then tragically cut to the scene of Deirdre being kidnapped. When Sigurd takes the next castle, he and Oyfi talk. Oyfi gives a motivated request to allow him to join the fray and begin helping out with the army on the battlefield, as he's been learning a lot from all the new allies they've gained. Sigurd consents to this, but with one caveat. Oyfi is to wear the ring he bought for Deirdre so that he might still advise Sigurd and to keep Oyfi safe. Sadly, what he was unable to do for Deirdre. From then on, Oyfi would be a unit. Each time Sigurd takes a castle, Oyfi would automatically teleport next to him to join in the conversation at the castle. In addition, Oyfi would teleport away if killed in combat to rejoin the Lord as just the advisor, or you could just make him a game over screen, like most avatars. In addition, he'd have the innate ability to self-warp to captured castles on demand, which would be an interesting but not out of the ordinary ability for a character in Fe4. As I already said, it would be to the warp staff what the return ring is to the return staff. This also would all apply to Gen 2 to allow him to have more screen time in the second half of the game. Another consequence with giving the player an explicit representative in the game that they're supposed to relate to is one which Fire Emblem usually ignores, that being meta information. The more information you give the player that the character doesn't have, the less connected they are. Fire Emblem often shows you conversations between enemies and characters nowhere near the protagonists, for both story and gameplay purposes. Gameplay ones like hints at recruitable units or enemy reinforcements are fine as long as they're limited to simple things like that. But when the player knows what enemies are scheming before the character, it can lead to a disconnect. You can imagine a situation where your character falls into a trap that you know about because you saw the enemy say it. That draws attention to the fact that you don't have complete control over your protagonist. And we want the opposite to happen, for you to fade into them. Fe4 in particular has a lot of information conveyed this way. For example, no one ever learns that Arvis is responsible for Seliph getting Tearfing back, something which would likely have a big impact on Oyfi. Important information like this ideally should get back to Oyfi and Seliph so that we can see them react to it. So that's the idea. Use an avatar to reframe the story of Fire Emblem Genealogy of the Holy War in a way that's more emotionally impactful. Do I think this is likely to occur in an actual Fe4 remake? No, not at all. But that's not exactly the point of this. This video is more about avatars than Fe4 specifically. It's a case for avatars as a concept via one specific example. They could add a lot to a game if implemented with a specific purpose that the game is then built around. It just so happens that Fe4 seems to be already built for it. As I went over with the avatars in the beginning, many of the avatars' statuses is not fully used to improve upon the games they're in, despite there being opportunities to do so. Avatar is not a bad word, it's just poorly implemented.